Hi Year 12. I just wanted to go through these revision notes for Common Module with you so that you have some of my input like you would if I was standing in front of you in the classroom. Obviously, we are up to doing text and human experiences revision today. This is just a quick overview in terms of going back to your rubric and revisiting some of the elements in your rubric, which is really important. Obviously, we did Common Module quite a long time ago now, so you're going to have to rewind a lot of your brains and think through some of what we did right at the end of last year. Very importantly, I just wanted to draw your attention here in your notes to a couple of key points from the rubric. These key points, Year 12, are really significant because obviously you've got to remember that the rubric really determines any of the questions that you can be asked in paper one. So if you've got a really good grasp of the pieces in your rubric for both section 1 and obviously your essay in section 2, then that gives you a much better scope to prepare your responses prior to your exams. So if you can have a think through, as it says there, some of those key points, and obviously then for revision purposes, particularly for the Merchant of Venice, being able to prepare your notes really to connect with these elements in the rubric, because then it gives you the greatest scope to obviously then look at different questions that fall under these pieces of the rubric. So I've got there your key rubric points broken into just some statements that obviously focus on different elements. So have a quick read through those. This is just a bit of a guideline for your writing in section one, for paper one rather, for both section 1 and section 2 for your essay. It's a really good idea, Year 12, to start with a statement that encapsulates something about a representation of human experiences within the text. And I'm talking now whether that's section 1, your short answers, or section 2, your essay. So that's really an idea or an experience that's being represented through the text. What you then want to make sure you do is connect that experience to some aspect of an emotion or a quality that's being crafted through that experience within the text. Then, of course, as you know, your analysis of language is critical. As always in English, it's really important that you are considering intentionally how a composer is crafting their representations. How are they using language to convey those ideas to us about human experiences, about human emotions? So, of course, language features are very critical for you to make sure you're connecting into that discussion. That idea around anomalies, paradoxes, and inconsistencies, striving, if you remember when we were doing Common Module, to think about anything that's really unusual or odd or doesn't make a lot of sense in the way that the text is crafting a representation. So have a think through whether that's somehow indicative of some anomaly or some paradox within human behaviour or within human motivations. And again, what you should be able to then do is consider how that enables you as a responder to think through some of the aspects around human experiences. Maybe it challenges some emotions or assumptions that we have. Maybe it makes you think through some of your ideas about those particular elements in your own world experience. Big idea, very much connected to the rubric here, is the role of storytelling. And often students, particularly when we're not studying a narrative text per se, in section 2, overlook this element in the rubric. The fact that your composer, Shakespeare, is ultimately a storyteller. And you need to then think about how he is telling a story to us about human experiences that represents particular individual lives and, of course, particular cultures or groups. Finally, you should always make sure, Year 12, that your discussion within Common Module is connected to your developing personal understanding. So being able to connect some of what you're exploring in a text with your own real world experiences and your real world knowledge, being able to tangibly connect those pieces, the representation, to your own understanding is really, again, one of the crucial elements here in Common Module. In terms of coming back to look at The Merchant of Venice, what I've done here is I've gone through and started. I haven't obviously completed because I want you to engage with this summary process. Some notes for The Merchant of Venice that really work through aligning your revision notes with some of those pieces of the rubric that I've just outlined. So I want you to obviously continue or develop these notes into your own summary notes for The Merchant of Venice. So being able to look at what I've scaffolded here and then further develop and adapt and obviously create for yourself some really good summary notes that come back to The Merchant of Venice and how it obviously represents different elements of our common module rubric. So the first one there you can see on the screen is the individual human experiences that are being represented by Shakespeare within The Merchant of Venice. I want you to think about these individual experiences connecting to obviously qualities and emotions that are being crafted within the play. The best way to do this, Year 12, is obviously to consider Shakespeare's intentional crafting of individual characters within the play, because those individual characters enable us to consider individual experiences. So obviously, one of our most important characters in this play to consider is Shylock. So as you can see there, I've just got a couple of points underneath Shylock's characterization. And of course, you can change, you can adapt, you can enhance any of these ideas. If you don't want the ones that I've got sitting there, please change them, please make them your own. But what I've done is I've focused on just a couple of experiences for Shylock's character. So I'm focusing in my notes on the representation of revenge, this idea around conflict, around retributive justice, retaliating or punishing people when they've hurt us or harmed us. They're all very common human experiences, but we see them embodied within the crafting of Shylock's character. Similarly, we have the representation of discrimination being crafted quite importantly through his character in the play. And that obviously aligns with any kind of prejudice or unjust mistreatment that individuals endure within their experiences. The fact that he is an outsider, he is an other, and obviously that notion of being marginalised or being an alienated character within experiences is a really important element to consider around his crafting of character here. In terms of qualities and emotions that are most obvious in terms of Shylock's characterization, you've got an incredible bitterness from Shylock for much of the play. He's really bitter about what's happening to him and even associated with his daughter running off in secret. There's an inherent bitterness in the way that he's responding emotionally to some of the experiences. There's a hostility, there's a determination. And determination is a very important quality within human experiences. He's determined to not just give up. He's determined to fight. He's determined to get back at those who have wronged him. There's a hatred embodied within his character. He is unforgiving, he's vindictive, he's resilient, he's stubborn, he's cunning. Again, think of some intentional qualities that he represents or emotions that you see evident within his character. And again, try to develop those points perhaps a little further alongside the experiences that Shakespeare's representing through his character. Then what you do, very importantly, is go here to your analysis of the key features and support that with quotes from the play that represent some of the experiences that you've identified associated with Shylock's character. So what I've got there quite obviously for you, and I'm not going to read through all of them, is some of the key examples from the play that you can connect to Shylock. And so what you should be able to then do is find some really strong examples that you can then always come back to discuss, no matter what experience, no matter what element of the representation you're discussing in terms of Shylock's characterization, and using some of those key quotes to support your discussion in your essay. So have a look through the elements there that I've given you, and of course, as I've said, adapt any of this to suit your own purposes, change things, add other elements. This is just meant to be a scaffold that shows you some of my thinking in terms of revision for the play. So have a look through that. Those notes are sitting there ready for you to adapt. What you then should be able to do, Year 12, is come to focus upon any insights you get around anomalies, inconsistencies, and paradoxes. Please don't avoid this part of the rubric. It's really crucial that these elements are considered very intentionally alongside some of what you're discussing in light of your text. And often this is the part of the rubric where students think, oh, it's a bit tricky or it's a bit complicated, I'm just going to avoid it. Please don't do that, because there are questions that obviously target these ideas around what's anomalous and what's paradoxical. So if you've got some good planning and revision notes here, it means that you can really get a good grasp of those questions if you're asked to respond to these kind of ideas. Obviously, you've got some interesting anomalies that Shakespeare's crafting through Shylock's character. So you can see some of the points that I've put in your notes around Shylock, for example, paradoxically agreeing to loan Antonio the money. He's a sworn enemy, and yet right from the start of the play, he agrees to loan him this money, which is one of the elements that propels our plot, obviously, in this play. But that's paradoxical. That doesn't make sense. Why would someone who hates another person agree to loan them money in human experiences? So again, we see some of these unusual behaviours that are being crafted by Shakespeare. The notion that Shylock, as it says there, is a really polarising character in terms of whether we consider him as the villain or whether he's ultimately the victim of this play. And Shakespeare's positioning us, I think, at least initially, to understand some of Shylock's reasoning. Now remember, we're coming from a contemporary perspective in our attitudes and response to the play. Very different to Shakespeare's Renaissance Elizabethan world, where Shylock would have been a detested kind of character because of the Christian worldview. But obviously here, we've got a more holistic grasp of diversity and difference, and we're kind of constructed as a contemporary responder to have a sense of empathy and an understanding for why Shylock is the way he is. So again, that's somewhat anomalous in terms of how we respond to his character. Again, I've got there a point. Shylock is ultimately defeated within the play because he is an anomaly within the world. That means that he doesn't fit. He's an anomaly because he is an outsider. He's not a stereotypical character within this world of the play. So again, the fact that Shakespeare ultimately has him destroyed at the end of the play is because he is different. And again, that gives you some scope to think about the representation of human experiences here. As humans, do we just want to destroy those who are different to us? Do we want to get rid of anyone who doesn't align with our own attitudes and values and behaviours within human experiences? Again, it gives you scope to think through the way he's crafting this character. What you then have space for, and what is really important, and obviously I haven't done this on your behalf, is your personal connection. So considering all those elements around Shylock's character, what have you come to understand about some of your own experiences in life with characters like Shylock? Now, it doesn't have to be a Jewish moneylender, obviously. The kind of character that Shylock represents in your own experiences. So as I said, that may be someone who is on the fringes, someone who is a sworn enemy of you, someone who doesn't fit the stereotypical norms within a particular human group or experience. How do you now respond to that kind of character from what you've studied in this play? How has the text and the representation of these experiences shaped some of your own attitudes, some of your own thinking now? And again, that gives you scope to connect what you've studied in a text to your own real world experiences. And as I said, that's really where your discussion should land. You need to get that personal understanding really strongly conveyed through your analytical responses here. Obviously, then in your notes, as you can see, if you keep scrolling, you've got Portia as another character, another individual character who obviously represents very different experiences and ideas to Shylock. So you've got some points there to think through in terms of what she embodies and what she represents for Shakespeare's crafting. Again, different qualities and emotions that we see through Portia's character. Again, I've given you just a few, not as many, because I want you to actually do some of this actively yourselves, make them your notes. Some of the key features and quotes from the play that Portia's experiences align with. So you go to the text to find your evidence. So I've given you some evidence there, but I want you to keep developing those notes for Portia. Again, any insights into anomalies, inconsistencies, and paradoxes through Shakespeare's crafting of Portia's character. And then again, personal connection. How do you understand something through your engagement with Portia's character in the text? How has she enabled you as a responder to consider some of your own experiences? And again, what you're doing here, Year 12, is you're connecting the world of the text to your own experiences of the real world more generally. So again, think through what you've come to reflect upon, perhaps through some of her character. Thirdly, an individual character, obviously very important in this play, is Antonio. But of course, Year 12, you can choose any character. You could choose Bassanio, you could choose really anyone, Jessica. Your choice here is really ultimately what you're wanting to focus upon. The only, I guess, scope I'd give you to consider is try to choose characters or individuals that give you different experiences to explore. You don't want to be exploring the same kind of ideas or representations through different characters. That's kind of pointless. So really be intentional in your notes in thinking through different individual characters. You can do that for as many characters as you want. Realistically, in a 40-minute essay, I don't think you're going to have to do more than 3 or 4 in terms of this process of summary. Obviously, Antonio, I've left quite blank for you to consider. Okay, the next element in the notes, as you can see if you keep moving through, is you're moving from the individual representation of human experiences to the collective representation of human experiences. So this is where you're not getting just an individual experience, but you're getting an experience that's indicative of a group. And again, we're looking at it through the scope of our text, The Merchant of Venice, and it's the same process, but you're shifting it from an individual to a group represented within the play by Shakespeare. So the first one I've got here in your notes, obviously, is the representation of women as a group within the play. So obviously, considering your context here, or Shakespeare's Elizabethan Renaissance world, the crafting of the women is really significant because obviously, as we've discussed, Shakespeare does push some of those societal expectations and assumptions. He loves crafting female characters that have a voice, have a strength of character. Remembering again that within his context, very patriarchal, male-dominant, misogynistic values that are embedded within his world. But again, thinking through what he's crafting here about women and their experiences is really important in giving you a scope for looking at the representation in the play alongside some of your own attitudes and thinking. So obviously here you've got women, their struggle for equality or for recognition within the patriarchal society in the play, the voiceless, the powerlessness of women within that hierarchical structure, that chain of being idea. Even more broadly, the way that women in the play are a minority group. They are less dominant. There's only a few women in the play compared to a lot of men. And again, the fact that they are without agency in society. They have no scope to independently act because of that very entrenched belief that women were possessions, they were belongings to either fathers or then husbands. So again, that representation of women as an experience in the play is really significant and again gives you scope to consider. Think through some of the qualities and the emotions that the women collectively portray in our play. Perhaps resilience, intelligence. Don't overlook Portia's intelligence. She's probably the most intelligent, in some ways very silly and fickle, but in the way that she is able to respond as a female in this very male-dominated world. The way that they're crafted to have respect, they're respectful, despite their frustrations, perhaps with some of their limitations, they still align with the entrenched social order. So they don't, for example, Portia doesn't fight against her dead father's love test. She's respectful and acknowledges that as a female, she has to be subordinate and align with his wishes, even though he's no longer around. There's a sense of honesty that we see crafted through the women. Love for one another. They are very closely, particularly Nerissa and Portia. And there's a strength of character that we see crafted through these women. Jessica, the fact that she's bold enough and strong enough to run away, which is incredibly brave considering her world and her experiences of family. And Shakespeare's crafting that again as a representation of women. Have a look again for some of the examples from the play. Go back to your text, Year 12, and find evidence to support some of those ideas. Again, any anomalies, any inconsistencies that you can connect, any paradoxes that we see crafted through Shakespeare's representation of women, and then again, the personal connection. What have you come to understand about the representation of women in this text? What has it made you reflect on, Matt? What has it made you consider in your own experiences, perhaps? Relationships. I've called relationships a collective group, and there's quite a number of different relational aspects that are being crafted by Shakespeare in the play. So I've given you a few further notes here because obviously I wanted you to see some of my thinking. You can change, as I've mentioned, any of these elements to suit your own purposes. This is just meant to be a scaffold for you. Relationships such as the friendship, such as love and marriage that we see represented, these groups of people that are in love and people that are married or seeking to be married. Groups of family, the representation of family groups. Again, you've got different elements here that Shakespeare's crafting under the broader representation of collective relationships. Think through once again some of the qualities and emotions when you're thinking about those examples from the play. What elements in terms of qualities being represented through those collective relationships? What emotions do you see as represented? Again, go through and find some evidence, some features. Make sure you've got specific features that Shakespeare's crafting, specific quotes to support your ideas here around the collective representation of relationships. Again, any insights into anomalies, inconsistencies, and paradoxes, and then once again, the personal connection. I've given you then some notes to think about under the representation of the collective religion or the collective racial constructs. And I've kind of connected those two together because in the play I think they kind of work alongside each other, but obviously they are different constructs. So again, think through, I've given you some notes there, obviously most aligned with Shylock, but considering the broader representation within the dominant Christian worldview of the Elizabethan world, alongside a crafting of this racial, religious otherness that we see in the play. So again, have a think through some of the notes there, and again, you're doing the same pieces here as we've been talking through. The last one, which I think is an interesting one for you to think through, is the collective representation of wealth. Obviously, we could think about it in terms of class in Shakespeare's crafting. But I think wealth gives you greater scope to obviously align with some of your own experiences in your contemporary world. We don't have so much class as we do status associated with wealth. So you've got there, again, I've given you, to support some of your thinking here, some elements that you might want to consider and some quotes which I think are important in the representation of collective wealth as an idea, and then again anomalies, paradoxes, and personal connection that you need to fill in. Where next in these notes? So that's the experiences focus, year 12. You've got individual experiences and collective experiences, which is a big part of our common module, obviously. As I mentioned, however, a big element that sometimes students overlook at this point, they're very good at identifying experiences because obviously that's the focus of the module. But there's a part in your rubric that really gets you to consider the role of storytelling within human experiences. Why, as humans, we tell and learn from stories in our experiences. So here what you've really got to think about is William Shakespeare as a storyteller. The way that he's crafting experiences within his text, human experiences, is indicative of the fact that he is crafting a story to help his responders think and understand aspects of their own experiences in the real world. So you've got to be able to shift some of your notes here to really identify how William Shakespeare is a storyteller. Now, this, as I mentioned, is a little bit of a stretch because you don't have a traditional story-based text, like, for example, a novel or a short story, which are more easily connected to some of those elements of storytelling. You've got a dramatic play, but within the crafting of that textual form, the dramatic play, it is still a story. So what you're still needing to do here is think about the way the narrative within the dramatic play is being crafted by Shakespeare. So I've given you here, focus upon elements of narrative and dramatic form. So don't overlook narrative features and don't overlook dramatic features that Shakespeare's crafting within his story. So you've got, for example, some very easy, basic aspects of a story, such as the plot, the events that happen within this play. All right, and they are, for example, the key moments within the story of the play. What happens in this text? For example, you could be talking about the conflict between Antonio and Shylock around the loan right from the outset. That compels much of the action that follows in the play. So Shakespeare crafts that conflict between two humans to really drive the story of the text. You've got as subplots, so the subplot is not the dominant events, they are the underlying events. You've got, for example, the subplot of the deception of young Jessica as she runs off with her lover, Lorenzo. So again, this idea of a daughter abandoning her family expectations and running away to pursue love, this romantic love. That is a key event within the subplot of this story, and Shakespeare's bouncing some of his main plot off some of the aspects of the subplot, deception. So what I want you to do here is just identify for yourself some pieces of the story in terms of the plot within this text. What you're then asked to think through is the genre. And we talked, remember, when we were looking at the play, about the fact that this is traditionally a Shakespearean comedy, but there's some very serious aspects being represented by Shakespeare. So those very heavy kind of ideas as well that Shakespeare bounces the comedic aspects off. So think through, he doesn't have anyone die or, well, Shylock obviously suffers, but there is, I guess, that notion of it being a very fine line in human life between the comedy where everything works out well and positively and the serious tragic elements. And again, thinking through the crafting of the story in terms of a genre. Big aspect for you to think through again is the structure, the way the story is put together by the composer here. So the way they are intentionally crafting and developing the pieces of their narrative. And don't forget, this is not just a narrative story, it's also a dramatic text. So you've got the classic narrative structure of orientation, complication, climax, and resolution. They're the traditional narrative features within narrative-based text that we have. But here also with Shakespeare's, you've got another layer to that structure because you've got his crafting of the dramatic structure. The way, for example, he positions scenes. So, for example, you have some really comedic, melodramatic scenes. Think, for example, some of those elements around the suitors coming in to win the love test for Portia. You've got some of those scenes early in Act 1, which are quite comedic and silly, alongside some of the seriousness around Shylock's experiences and his bitterness. So what Shakespeare's doing dramatically then is he's again bouncing those aspects dramatically off each other as a structural device. So he's having us as an audience laugh and release some of the tension that we feel when we're experiencing and watching, performing some of those really heavy, serious moments of the play. So think through maybe some of the interplay there in the way that the play is structured. Setting, obviously an important feature of narrative texts, of stories, is the crafting of setting, place, time and place. So here obviously you've got Shakespeare crafting a very overt contrast between his choices of setting in Venice compared to Belmont, Portia's Belmont. And again, think through the way that he's crafting as an idea what Venice represents in terms of this wealth, this desire for wealth, this development of the mercantile trade, everything focused on money and that aspect of human experiences, compared to Belmont, which is this seemingly removed little experience of love and the importance of relationships and connection, and the way that Shakespeare crafts in his storytelling these two settings to obviously represent different aspects of human experiences. So again, think through. The other very important setting that I want you conscious of here is the courtroom setting. The courtroom setting, which is very much associated with justice and truth in human experiences. And here there is a bit of an irony that Shakespeare crafts quite intentionally through this courtroom setting. Again, thinking through the way that he's representing some of his ideas around, particularly the social crafting of a character like Shylock, and perhaps the mistreatment that he receives because he is different to the dominant. Again, we've talked through, and you can simply consider very briefly here what you've already looked at around some of those key characterizations, because obviously the crafting of character is a very important aspect of storytelling. So think through maybe what some of the characters represent in Shakespeare's storytelling. The last point here, which is separate to the storytelling, obviously language, has to underpin everything in English, but certainly here there is questions that focus your discussion on a particular crafting of language. So what you have to be prepared to do, Year 12, is have some specific features of language that you've made a really strong focus within your thinking around Shakespeare's crafting of the representation of human experiences. So what you're doing here is you're thinking about the way that Shakespeare intentionally crafts particular features within his play. Now, remember, you're looking at a text that is a dramatic play. So you're not just looking at this text as written words on a page, despite what we've done predominantly within our analysis of this text, where we've looked at it mostly through the language on the page. You've got to be able to consider some of the elements around the performance, remembering that Shakespeare has really crafted this text as a performance on a stage for his audience. So what you're looking at here is identifying some of the most important features within both the dramatic crafting and the language, the written crafting of Shakespeare. So what I would suggest you do here is, just for yourself, have some key points planned in summary around, for example, the soliloquies, the individual speeches that Shakespeare crafts in this play. So think for here, example of Portia's mercy speech, for example. You've done some close notes on the crafting of that mercy speech. Similarly, you've got notes on the very famous soliloquy by Shylock, the Jew, the pleading for understanding of difference, and have a look again at the way Shakespeare crafts those soliloquies within his dramatic crafting. Think about the asides here, the way that Shakespeare uses the asides. Now remember, asides in dramatic texts are those lines that are spoken aloud by a character, but that other characters don't hear. The audience hears, and they create what it says there around dramatic irony when we know what the characters don't. So it gives us a privileged position as an audience. So look at some of the asides, for example, that you have Shakespeare craft for Shylock early in the play. Dramatic irony, I've just mentioned. Humour, and we've talked about this alongside the comedic aspects, but the way there's humour that's being crafted and the reason why Shakespeare's crafting humour. Use of stage directions. Again, stage directions are crafted by Shakespeare intentionally to give the performers some knowledge around what he wants them to be doing. So it's almost like he's directing some of the performance of the play as the composer. The use of dramatic foreshadowing. An example of that would be the fact that right from the opening scene of the play, Antonio mentions that Shylock will become a Christian. And certainly in the final, not in the final, in the courtroom scene, we know that he's forced to become a Christian as part of his punishment. So that dramatic foreshadowing, Shakespeare loves dropping in little cues and hints throughout his crafting. Again, you've got to identify, you don't need to identify all of those, but have a few of them, the most important ones. They're sitting ready to be utilised. The language techniques. Don't overlook Shakespeare's rich crafting of language. So have a look, Year 12, through specific examples for yourself of imagery. The way that Shakespeare crafts, for example, extensive animal imagery, extensive biblical imagery, and again what that represents in terms of his representation of human experiences. Recurring motifs in the play, the use of repetition, the use of contrast, and again, some of the figurative language such as metaphors that we see. Have for yourself identified some of those key pieces alongside key quotes, and that does really set you up to have a good summary of different parts of the play to connect with different types of questions here. So what I want you to do is obviously get these notes on your own devices and start to work through and develop them for your own purposes. That's what I want you doing this lesson. If you have any questions, obviously, please email me. And tomorrow, what I'm expecting is that you'll have this summary work kind of developed enough to be working for yourself, and then we're going to look at some questions and how perhaps some of the questions for Common Module can be connected to these different parts of your revision notes. All the best, and I am hopeful of seeing you very soon back in the classroom. Take care.